Hello, everyone. This is Emily Kalashevsky, Member Programs Lead at the League, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is titled The Future of Public Safety Webinar Series, Reimagining Community Engagement. What does it take to cultivate a department-wide culture that puts community engagement and collaborative problem solving at the center? The Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office offers a unique answer. Hire an outside social worker to run community engagement, and instead of partitioning that individual away from the bread and butter of law enforcement operations, elevate them as an executive level leader within the organization. In 2009, Washtenaw County Sheriff Jerry Clayton hired Derrick Jackson, a social worker running the homeless shelter Ozone House, to be his new Director of Community Engagement. Today, we'll learn how the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office brings a new approach to community engagement and to policing more generally, one that works in partnership with the community and that seeks to reimagine how law enforcement can promote public safety outside of strict arrest. A few notes before we get started. Following the presentation, I will be facilitating a Q&A with participants. To submit questions, please type them in the chat box on the upper left side of your screen. Following today's session, we will also email any links or slides referenced to all participants, so I can assure you you'll all get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. And now let me formally introduce our speakers today. We have Sheriff Jerry Clayton, Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. Jerry Clayton is currently serving his third term as Sheriff of Washtenaw County, leading an organization of approximately 420 staff committed to serving a Washtenaw County population of over 358,000. Sheriff Clayton has provided training and subject matter expert consulting services to a variety of private and public sector clients, including various sheriff's offices and police departments across the country, the National Sheriff's Association, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Jerry has received international recognition for his expertise and work in the criminal justice profession and also served as a governor-appointed commissioner for the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards since 2013. Additionally, Jerry is a New York University School of Law Policing Project Advisory Board member, governor-appointed member of the Michigan Joint Task Force on Jail and Pretrial Incarceration, and the National Association of Counties and the National Sheriff's Association's Reducing Jail Inmate Recidivism through Continuity of Healthcare Services Task Force. Sheriff Clayton serves on the boards of numerous local organizations, including one of my personal favorites, the local chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Washtenaw County. Sheriff Clayton attended Eastern Michigan University, majoring in Public Safety Administration. He also graduated from the EMU School of Staff and Command and numerous other leadership programs. We also have Derrick Jackson, Director of Community Engagement for Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. Derrick Jackson joined the Sheriff's Office in 2009, where colleagues have come to know him as the social worker that became a police officer. Mr. Jackson graduated from Eastern Michigan University with a Bachelor in Social Work and gained his Master's from the University of Michigan. As a social worker and certified law enforcement officer, he has a unique perspective and role in building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Director Jackson has spent the last 12 years learning, understanding, deconstructing, redesigning, and implementing systems within the Washtenaw County community that have helped reimagine the role of police within community and the role of social workers within law enforcement. Where some may see social work and law enforcement on the opposite ends of the spectrum, Director Jackson redefines the spectrum and uses social work and law enforcement to enhance the impact of both. Thank you both for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you to begin.
Well, thank you for having us. We're both honored to participate and share some thoughts. So I know we have a finite amount of time. I think we used half of them in our introductions. So we will get right to it. So I think as we think about the title of this, or reimagining community engagement, it's really about reimagining your organization. And I'll start with this way. So it's a matter of leadership. And from an organizational perspective, leadership is always important. But I think in the time and the space that we're in now, leadership has never been more important. Whether it's appointed leadership or elected leadership, hired leadership, does not matter. And I'll say one more thing about this concept of leadership. It's not just relegated to the person that's been formally designated as the leader of the organization or people on the executive team. We all have a leadership responsibility. And as we talk about how we have tried to move things in Washtenaw County, one of the first things we recognize is that leadership is everybody's responsibility in the organization. And ultimately, it's our responsibility to illuminate the leadership roles that people have. So this process for creating an infinite-minded organization, and some would say, well, what do we mean by infinite-minded? I am a fan and follower of Simon Sinek. And Simon started off with this whole concept of having to answer the why for people in your organization that helps give them purpose in what they do. And he's evolved to this concept too of being infinite minded. And when we think about being infinite minded, it's really about thinking about the long term. Even when I talk briefly about our mission is never complete because we've always got something that we're striving for. So the first step, I think, the leadership responsibility in terms of creating an infinite minded organization is really providing a clear vision. You're not a leader if people don't choose to follow. People are less likely to follow if they do not know where you're taking them. Remember, we're asking, especially in this era of organizational change, we're asking staff to abandon to some degree what they used to believe in and what they wanted to work towards to something new. And for them to do that, they have to be able to see where they're going and why they're going there. The second thing is to be able to articulate a mission, and not just having a mission statement, but being able to articulate not just the mission, but the ultimate outcomes of our work. Why do we exist? What is our purpose? Why are we going to put all this work in? Why would I follow you? Tell me what ultimately where we're going. So you have to lay that out. And there's two more pieces, and I have them: culture and operational philosophy. I'm going to switch and talk about aligning operational philosophy, the ultimate outcomes of the organization. And what we mean by operational philosophy is simply this: it's the basic beliefs, the fundamental beliefs, the concepts, and the principles that exist in an organization. That when you operationalize those beliefs and principles and concepts, it really guides the behavior of your staff and the performance of your operation. And you have to be intentional about that. And that, the operational philosophy, has to support the culture of the organization. So, this reimagining organizational culture. And why is culture so important? So, Peter Drucker was given the credit of saying culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but that has never been confirmed. But we do know Mark Fields, who's the president of Ford Motor Company, did say this: that organizational culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so don't leave it unattended. So, what did he mean by that? It means you can have the best policy in place, you can have the best training in place, you can pour over operational protocol, but if the people in the organization do not believe the same things, if they're not working from the same foundational understanding of who they are, why they exist, and what their purpose is, you're not going to get the kind of change that you want. And if what we're really talking about here is leading organizational change, and in a police organization, leading that change toward an embracing of community engagement, you really have to pay attention to the culture. So, really quick here is our cultural formula, or is the cultural formula. So, the pattern here in this circle starts with the beliefs. What are the beliefs in the organization? What are the basic assumptions? Why we exist? Who we serve? So, in our organization, we believe we exist to serve. We believe everybody we come in contact with is a customer of our service, even someone we arrested, someone that we are holding in our jail. You are a receiver of the services we deliver, our behavior, our performance. So we should be aware of how we act. Then beliefs influence the values in an organization. So I'm going to go back: values, principles, and it's the values and principles that guide behavior. So again, it's not the policy. I can't legislate so much behavioral change if I don't have aligned values and beliefs in the organization. Those behaviors create the experiences that people have. And if you change your behavior, you can change your experience. And this is important when we talk about when we brought Derrick in. When we took office, I knew I wanted to challenge the status quo in our organization around who we are and what we were capable of, and how we could work to co-produce public safety in Washtenaw County. But I knew I had a vision for it, but I didn't know how to go about doing it. So reaching out to Derrick and understanding what he had done in the past, in other areas, understanding his skill sets, and really just understanding who Derrick was, he's the perfect person to bring into an organization for a couple of reasons. Just his emotional intelligence, his understanding of social work and people, and his tenacity and courage. So bringing Derrick into an organization like ours, who's is new now, we're bringing in new leadership, and for him to have the courage to challenge the status quo, to challenge our beliefs and our basic assumptions, and not only to challenge it, but then give us an alternative, and to do it in a way that wasn't threatening to our staff, that was actually inviting to them, to do it in a way and to lay out values and a vision along with the rest of us that resonated with our staff. People come to police because they want to serve. There's nobility in the profession and nobility in the people. And Derrick has a unique way of tapping into that. And that really was the key for us. So if I want to talk about courage and leadership, I think maybe there was a little courage to bring him in, but the real courage laid with his ability to really just jump in there, not be shy about it, and really challenge what Washtenaw County Sheriff Office is and was. And I'll end with this piece and turn it over to Derrick. It's not just going against just new leadership. Washtenaw County has existed now for 198 years. There's 198 years of institutional learning and history. You can't undo that. What you can is you build on it. And when you're changing organizational culture, you have to understand there's a long institutional history there. The leaders may change, but the institutional history remains. And if you're changing organizational culture, you must know that history and know if you're not deliberate and intentional all the time in changing the culture, because it's an ongoing process, you run the risk of going back to the way it is. So I'll turn it over to Derrick.
Thanks, Sheriff. So first of all, what I realized is I need to up my game when it comes to my bio and my intro. It's so much less than yours, Sheriff. So, but I'll just say this, that I didn't necessarily, even as a social worker in the work that I do now, a lot of people assume, they're like, well, Derrick, you kind of created this great thing of having social work in law enforcement, and now it's a popular thing to talk about. And the sheriff doesn't always bring this up, but honestly, when he first rolled this out, I couldn't see that vision. I was someone who worked in the community as a social worker, and naturally had a mistrust, I would say, a little bit of law enforcement. I worked with homeless teens, and we spent a lot of time trying to keep those two populations away. The reason I start with that is because, first of all, I didn't have that vision. Someone kind of shared it. It was the sheriff with me, and convinced me that it was possible. But now that I've seen it, and I would say this to some of our elected officials or folks who are designing systems or thinking about this work or who are on the call, it took me a while to fundamentally understand the criminal justice system. And what I realized is the stuff that I was thinking about as a social worker working in the community, at least for me, was a little bit off. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So I worked with homeless teenagers, and again, we kept them separate from law enforcement, right? We had policies and procedures in place that really tried to protect the young people we cared about, the most vulnerable, from police. But now that I look back on it, it was oftentimes the officer that was bringing that young person to the shelter, or who was finding that runaway out on the street. And even though at the time we thought we were protecting, now when I look back on it, every night when I went home to sleep as a social worker, guess who was out on the street? It was that officer and that young person. And I wasn't doing my job as a social worker to help prepare the young people that I cared about or the officers in our community to be able to work together when I wasn't there, to help keep them apart. And so what I've really found fascinating is, on both sides of the continuum, if we can say as far as sides, I think there's some misnomers, right? And I often talk about law enforcement officers go into the profession to serve the community, and social workers go into the profession to serve the community. We wind up getting trained different and start seeing the world a little bit differently. But in reality, we spend a lot of our time working with the exact same population. The most vulnerable of the vulnerable in our communities are involved in the criminal justice system, whether it's homeless, mentally ill, folks suffering from substance use disorder. So as a social worker, I just wanted to kind of put out there, it behooves us, our code of ethics requires us to really get involved with law enforcement. One of the other pieces I wanted to talk about too was just around this notion of kind of bringing the systems together. And so in this reimagining community engagement, it really is about the agency, the police being not just a service provider in the community, but a real partner within the community. We're a part of the community. So the sheriff will often say that the jail is not his jail, it's the community's jail. And we provide a service. And it's those small semantics, I think, and cultural shifts that really make a big difference. The last piece before I kind of jump into what we do at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office is there's a lot of discussions right now around defunding, abolishing, deconstructing law enforcement. And the one analogy that I keep giving is, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, even if you want to abolish the police, I would say that you can't just run into, the analogy is, any business, any building that you want to tear down, right? A skyscraper, for example. You need just as many architects to demolish it as you did to build it in the first place, right? You need to understand the current construct, the vulnerabilities, the weaknesses, the strengths. You need to build alternative structures to move stuff into before you ever set your first stick of dynamite. You can't just run in, throw dynamite around and get detonated. So regardless of where people may fall and the ideas that they have, I think one of the things that community engagement in our agency allows us to do is hear from, learn from the community, but also speak to and educate the community. And to not be afraid to be wrong sometimes, just put the facts out there and have trust in the community and trust in our staff to know that once people have the information and the language, they're going to make good decisions with that. And so with that, I'll just jump into some of the things that we do here at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. And every time I start, I like to ask people to think about what do you see when you see the badge, right? And whether that's something good like honor and integrity and protection, or something not as good like disdain or fear, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, law enforcement is here, the community is here, and this and what we try to do is how do you bridge those divides? And again, it doesn't matter if you think about you want to abolish police are here right now, or if you want to defund the police, how might you do that? It really is about how do we create systems and structures to bring folks together. The other piece, and this is a couple of tidbits that I'll start out with, is community engagement to us is more than a program or a unit. So a lot of police agencies will say they do community engagement or community policing. It's a couple of officers who really are good with speaking to residents, and it becomes what that unit does, not what the agency does. So for us, it's really a philosophy of how we operate at all levels. And I can't underestimate the structure really does matter. And so you can imagine that law enforcement, like many organizations, is hierarchical. It's about the chain of command. And so even if the sheriff said, hey, I have this great idea, I want you to be here, but I'm going to put you at the level of a deputy on the street or at the sergeant level, kind of lower within the structure, it makes it more difficult to really do this work when the sheriff isn't around. And so having the authority to be within the command structure, I think, is a really, really important piece. So when we think about how people may do this in their communities and they're thinking about reimagining community engagement, it isn't a program. It's a way of operating every single day at all levels of the organization. And within policing in particular, chain of command really matters. And so if you're really about investing in this kind of work, it isn't about taking the good officer who's good at neighborhood watch. It's about elevating the conversation to be at the administrative table. Much of what I do has nothing to do with a fun program or, as some would say, hug a thug kind of stuff or kissing baby stuff. It isn't that. It's really about the architecture and the fundamental structure of law enforcement, how we reimagine that every single day of what we do. I do want to go back to the infinite mindset. So we didn't get here yesterday. We're not going to be out of this tomorrow, right? And so some of this is about playing the long game. And so some of the things we do now, 12 years in, we may have had the idea in year one, but the agency wasn't ready, the community wasn't ready, I wasn't ready. Altogether, as a whole, we probably weren't ready to do some of the things that we now do, and I'll kind of walk through some of those examples. The other piece is, if we're waiting to engage the community in the midst of a crisis, it's way too late. The trust is destroyed. Trying to have a discussion or to engage community while you're in crisis is so difficult because it's being defined for you. So some of this is about doing things when times are good, continuing to do the same things over and over and over. What I've learned, particularly more recently, with a lot of the discussions in our community, is that we've been talking about this stuff for 12 years. Some in the community have been talking about it for that long, but many in our community have just awakened to this discussion. The masses have really awakened. So it behooves us to continue to push these things and have these discussions, comfortable and uncomfortable, at all times that we can. It's a two-way street, and so we do use community engagement to listen as much as we do to talk. So for many in community engagement around the country, it's about how do we share the good stuff we do in law enforcement. That's a part of it. But it's also, how do you have the mechanisms to make sure you hear clearly what the community is saying, and then you use that information to incorporate it into some of the policy training changes within the organization. And we'll talk about how we do some of that. already mentioned it's about becoming a part of the community, not just serving the community. And the way we look at our community engagement is it's a constant alternative, or that conscience on our shoulders, to really make sure all the decisions we're making around traditional policing, that there's an alternative to that. And so we think about some of those things. I just want to reference briefly what we look at as kind of 7 points of change. So I know some of this conversation around community engagement and reimagining is really like, how do you impact criminal justice reform or policing reform or jail reform? And so we're having this conversation. I'll say again, I'm a social worker who now loves to do this work and could talk all day about it, but I could not see how social work and law enforcement or criminal justice really interacted. And so it really was about leadership. So I know he's my boss and he's on the call, but I'll just say we're fortunate in Washtenaw County to have someone who, quite honestly, he didn't go to social work school, but I tell him all the time, deep down, he's actually always wanted to be a social worker. Like, he thinks about community in a way around solving problems, not just solving crime. And I think that's pretty important. The other is, some of this work was not easy. You can imagine there are folks within the profession, but also within the community, and expectations around some of the kinds of engagement that we do, which isn't always popular. And being able to take calculated risks for the right reasons and being able to stay true to our mission, even though there might be some political pushback or community pushback, I think is a really important standard for a leader to be able to have. If I talk to a lot of my peers who are doing this work, that's one of the first things they say is, it's very difficult, even if the leadership says they want to do it, if they're really not committed to it, and then you get shut down every step of the way. Some of the discussions we have are not easy. When you really engage the community, you're going to hear the truth. And some of that truth calls into question the historical consequences of using law enforcement in racist ways. That's a lot of the conversation we're having now. Those aren't easy discussions. And we become the door that hears that all the time. And so that's sometimes difficult. Community engagement, again, isn't just a program. It's really changed how we hire officers. It's changed our training. It changed the policy that we'll talk about. It changed how we promote folks and the competencies that we look for in those who become leaders in our organization. It changes how we do accountability. And ultimately, it does get to how we change the culture. So this is what we do. This is the image that we share. These are the programs. So this is the one programmatic side. When we first started this work, I want to say we had like 1 or 2 of these things. Now there's over 20 or so. And these are all ways, and I won't go through all of them, but if you are interested, like on our website, you can see this image, but there's also a program manual where each of these is really described in about a paragraph or 2. And we're always happy to share information. Some of these are one-time events. Some are small, intimate settings. Some are weekly events. And some just come about as issues may arise. Some are engagement where we just have fun. Some are educational where we're talking and learning from the community. And some, one of my favorite things to talk about is outreach related. Just Cuz, which is right at the very top of the circle. Just briefly, Just Cuz was created by a high school student. I was given a presentation about police brutality, and I said, I'm willing to answer all your questions, but I have these 3 gift cards, and the 3 students that have the best ideas of solutions, I'll give out the gift card. So, of course, all the students are paying attention, and they have all these great ideas. And one young man stood up and he said, Derrick, how about I get like 5 of my friends in a room, you get 5 of your deputies in a room, and we just talk just because. And that was also a term that the sheriff had always used from his childhood, and bringing up what his grandfather used to say, like, we do this just because it's the right thing to do. And so what we do now is we'll just order lunch or dinner. We'll get officers in a room and community members in a room, and we just talk just because. Not because any issue has happened, but just really getting to know each other. Now, that's a small, intimate event, and it doesn't change the entire community, but one thing that happened in that very first meeting I think is very specific to how powerful it can be. We have a group of teenage, mostly young Black boys who are in the room, and we have some officers that are diverse. And one of our Black officers stands up and says, you know, at one point in my career, I find myself having so much interaction with young Black men who look like me that I even question myself, am I in the right profession? So for his peers as officers to hear him talk about that, it really said something to them. For the young men in that room to be able to hear him talk about that, it really said something to them. And it's a different kind of perspective that gets brought up because of that. And again, that's not an easy conversation, But through all of these different ways, setting up mechanisms for us to listen, but also speak to community. Just a couple of other examples of the program stuff and what it takes the courage of leadership to allow for people to do this. If you've never seen this movie, I would say go watch it. The Hate U Give is a great movie. It's about police brutality and a young black man who was killed by a white officer and just all the different sides of that. So once I saw the movie, because my daughter made me see it, I came to the sheriff and I said, Sheriff, I want to, let's rent out the movie theater, take our entire admin team, let's watch the movie, let's have lunch, and let's just discuss it for the rest of the day. So again, it's a non-traditional way to have a discussion around a very tough topic. It's about taking all of our leadership, our commanders, our directors, our lieutenants, and some of our sergeants, and let's just have this not easy discussion. Because if we're having it internally, like the community is having it, then I think we can really learn from one another and challenge one another. And so, of course, the sheriff said, yes, let's do it, and we did it. It wasn't easy, but it's for us as a way to kind of learn internally. And so this didn't involve community members, but I think it was talking about a community issue. A couple of other quick ones programmatically, just to give you a sense of what we do and how we've done it over time and how we reimagine this community engagement. This picture may not mean much to you all, but it means a lot to us because the man on the right, Mr. Tucson, is one of our biggest critics, to put it minor. And then there's an officer on the left. And to have these events where you can have folks who challenge you and are tough in the community, but still be willing to have the discussion, and then officers who can hear those tough critiques, but still be willing to engage with community, I think is really, really important. It isn't easy, I know I keep saying that, but having mechanisms to bring people together around these tough issues, I think is a way for us to reimagine how we do community engagement. When the Black Lives Matter movement first began several years ago, some of my friends were involved in organizing some of our local protests. And the first thing that we did was come to the sheriff and say, hey, Sheriff, how about you meet with the Black Lives Matter leadership in our community? And it turned out to be a great discussion. Some of the things that they were asking for are some of the things that we were asking for. And the sheriff really could listen to them, but also speak to them. And so I know in some communities, the Black Lives Matter movement and the local law enforcement leadership may not ever get in the room. For us, it was one of the first things we did as soon as it really arose as a movement in our community. And so having the mechanism to have these tough discussions really does help once officers are out on the street and they come into contact, and it's just the officer and the individual. We let our officers know it's okay to engage in those discussions, but also for them to question us and then to have a voice in these discussions. It's also about creating ways for us as law enforcement not to be at the forefront. So this is just a picture of a group that's called Interrupters. They are volunteers, community members that go out and try to interrupt violence ahead of time. We support them. We show up to help them, but it's really about the residents going out there and leading some of these discussions. It's also those large events, 600 people or so. This was at a local university. We had a big town hall session to allow for individuals to release steam and really to question their criminal justice leadership and to have those difficult discussions in a community-wide setting. And the last one from a programmatic standpoint, this isn't all of them, this is some of the highlights, but something we do called Enhancing Police and Community Trust, or IMPACT. This is a picture of the sheriff really leading the law enforcement community in some of these discussions. It's solution focused. We get officers in a room, about 30 of them. We get community members in a room, about 30 of them, and they spend the entire day together. The first half of the day, officers go in one room, community members go in another room, and we ask them a series of questions, the same kinds of questions. And what we always find is that the officers want the same kind of things that the community members want. What I often see is that community and law enforcement, though, it's almost like they're speaking different languages. And so when they're speaking different language, how do we help to really translate that and get people on the same page? So for the second half of the day, they come together, share those answers, but we commingle the groups and we work on solutions. So those are just some of the programmatic things we do. And those programmatic things, I'll pause here for a second, Sheriff, to see if you want to interject, but these programmatic things help us lead into what I'll lay out next, some of the systemic structural changes that it's allowed us to do. Sheriff?
So Derrick, I don't know if if can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm having a little issue. I think my video went away, but if y'all can still hear me from an audible standpoint, I'll continue. So the next slide, Derek, if you can put that up, I don't know if I can do that right now. Is the 21st century policing? So there's this question around reform, and Derek sort of talked about it when he's saying, what does police reform look like? It ranges all the way from the abolitionists who want police to not exist anymore, all the way to people that want to do things like take the mental health responsibility away from police and give it to mental health specialists. And all of those things, I think, are up for discussion. I was just at a protest the other day, and I told folks I'm not afraid of the chant of defund the police. As a criminal justice leader, I believe we should lean into that discussion. I am worried about it if it's a hashtag, um, a talking point, um, political fodder for folks. That worries me. But if the conversation around defunding police results in us sitting down and having deliberate and thoughtful discussions about the outcomes we want in our communities, if it causes us to discuss and describe what a strong and sustainable community looks like that's achieved through creating public safety, um, and public safety is achieved by co-producing it with the community. If you want to have that discussion, I'm all for it. Let's sit down and talk about that. And it may end up where police won't do certain things anymore and another entity or group of people do it. That's fine. But to Derek's analogy, uh, if it's defund the police by just blowing up the building without having all the contingencies in place, the same people we're trying to protect are the first people that get harmed. So I want us to be really clear about that. The defund the police and how police act in certain communities, if we're rash and not thoughtful about how we do this, the same people that we want to protect are the people that get harmed first and get harmed the most. So one of the things that we talk about, okay, there's a way for reform. And reform can happen in a couple different ways. So there are three examples that we're moving forward in Washtenaw County. The first one is the 21st Century Policing Compliance Commission. So we know back in the later part of 2014, President Obama established his 21st Century Policing Task Force. That group was charged with the responsibility of really crafting strategies around what's the best policing approach to lead us into the 21st century. They came with a report in May of 2015. We have used that report for quite a bit of time to guide some of our policy and practices. There are 6 pillars that came out of that report and recommendations that came under each pillar. There are some for federal government, some for nonprofits, and some just for police agencies. We use that to guide us. What we have committed to do now, as part of our reform efforts, is to formally adopt all the recommendations in each of the 6 pillars. To not only adopt them, but to publicly report our level of compliance with each one of those recommendations, either not compliant, partially compliant, or fully compliant, and then stand up a commission of anywhere from 40 to 50 people, probably half of them from the community, and break that 40 or 50 people up into subcommittees assigned to each one of the pillars. And those individuals will assess our continued compliance with each of the pillars. And for the areas that we aren't compliant, they will work with us to develop policy, training, operational protocols, and the other things that go into building a culture in an organization to get to the outcomes that we want to get to. This is what we see as the true co-producing of public safety. Bringing community members in on the front end, not from the oversight perspective after something has happened, but on the front end when we're developing the culture and developing the organization itself. The second one is the Police Reform Academy. It's an idea that Derrick had to really help us. Look, if we're bringing people to the table, we want people to the table to have the best understanding of the profession, not just the way we do it, but what are the best practices in the profession. So the Police Reform Academy is an academy where we bring in community members and just lay out for them educational series, educational modules on all the critical factors that go into police, from use of force to training to hiring. Again, not just the Washington County way, but the way that is the best practices from a national perspective. For example, in use of force, let's lay out for them the Supreme Court decisions that really undergird all of our force continuum and everything of that nature. So we believe an educated community is our best partner. The more they're educated around the profession, the better they're able to help us evolve as an organization. And the last one is a civilian hiring committee. There are three ways that you impact culture in the organization, and not just by talking about it. It's who you promote, what you reward, and who you hire. So can we bring in community members to sit in as part of our interview panel for the people that we're looking to bring on as new members of the sheriff's office? Not just for the police side, but for corrections, for dispatch, and for others. And the one that's not on here that we're working on is that we want to bring in someone very similar to how we brought in Derrick as our community engagement director. We want to bring in a director of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So we do a lot of work in this space. I teach a lot of work in this space, but I recognize that's not my area of expertise. We need someone that does not have our worldview, has a different worldview, that is educated and informed in that space of diversity, equity, and inclusion to teach us how to be better in that space, to help us continue to evolve as an organization. And I'll end with this piece. How do you reimagine your community engagement? Is by reimagining the organization. It's by recognizing that it's not enough to just be the best. What we're really striving for is to be better, always be better. That's what's in alignment with that infinite mindset. Derrick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I will just say for those listening too, the previous slides of developing that trust and that understanding within both the community and our staff internally allows us to get to this point. To be able to have civilians on a hiring committee, you can imagine that if you don't have trust within within a community, no one wants to sit on the hiring committee. They think it's just a political move, or no one wants to be involved in the policing commission. They don't think anything is actually going to change. So the stuff on the front end that allows us to get to the point of having these really structural, systemic connections to people, I think is really important. I'm just going to run through a couple of other quick examples of how the community engagement and being willing to have the courage to do that work up front allows you to have some really good changes internally within the organization. We have a community outreach team. So this is one of the systemic structural shifts. These individuals have lived experience. Some have been in our jail. Some have come out of prison. They aren't trained informants. They are experts on community. And if we really want to listen to community and really want to build strong and sustainable communities and understand what's going on in some of our most difficult communities, like, you need to have people at the table who have that lived experience. And so in Washtenaw County, and I'm proud to say this, like, we are one of the only departments within county government and offices in county government that actually hires people with felonies. And again, we don't hire them to be informants or to sweep our floors. We hire them to be experts on community and really work with us. And I could talk all day about the impact that these individuals have on our hiring process, on our connection to the streets, but also on the safety of deputies in some of our more struggling areas. How individuals can help us understand substance use disorder, put a face to what the disease is. And now when people are carrying naloxone, or officers to revive someone who just overdosed, it isn't just about, well, the policy says that I need to do this. It's about an understanding that people can be better and people can recover. So now officers think about recovery and addiction in a much different way. So just because of time, I won't spend a ton of time on it. But when we talk about actual listening to community, having people on the staff who are from the community, live in the community, are connected to the streets, I think there's no better way to have that conscience on a law enforcement shoulder to make sure we're always holding ourselves accountable. We don't always need the community to show up to a meeting to tell us. We have staff who are from the neighborhoods that we spend the most time in and sometimes have the worst relationship with, sitting at our table every single day, who are a part of designing the systems internally. So when you think about reimagining community engagement, just know that it is possible to hire people with lived experience in a sheriff's office or in a police agency. We do it. We've been doing it for 12 years now. It is a reentry program for us, so it also gets to recidivism rates. If anyone is interested in that, I'd love to be able to share much more in the data behind it. Here are some other ways by engaging community. We were developing our immigration policy. And so it wasn't just us developing what we thought was right. It was about having some of our immigration advocates in our local community come in and co-design the process with us and the policy with us. No, we do not agree on everything. No, we do not do every single thing they wanted us to do. But having those individuals that we already knew were going to question us from the beginning, sitting at the table with us, learning with us, and co-producing with us is, again, one of those ways to think about policy development. The same thing happened around the lock zone. We have individuals who helped us design the policy, but also help us do the training, people with lived experience. So our officers know not just how to administer it, but why it's important to do it and have that value. Our body-worn camera, we developed a policy, but also then went out to the community and did these educational series where we educated them on the policy, but also asked them for feedback. One thing that many community members didn't think about was the privacy rights implications of an officer walking into your house who now has that video camera on. And as we started to have that discussion, it really allowed us to listen to and adjust our policy slightly on what community members' values were around being recorded with body-worn cameras. Finally, I'll just mention the raise the age in Michigan, even prior to the state changing the law of, in Michigan, 17-year-olds were considered adults in the criminal justice system. Having the discussion and having the criminal justice leaders come to the table, we raised the age in Washtenaw County prior to the state raising the age. These are all structural systemic changes that I think come about because of the ability to have that true, genuine trust and relationship with community, and then have the mechanisms. Last couple of slides, we have a philosophy on the road around problem solvers and problem-oriented policing. It isn't just around solving crime, it's about solving problems. So structurally within our organization, we have these things set up to where we're training officers and teaching them to be problem solvers, not just crime fighters. It may sound like a small, subtle difference, but when you have a rash of armed robberies of pizza delivery people, and then you go to the area, a crime fighter is going to say, how do I find and solve the crime? Who committed this one crime? We couldn't figure it out. A problem solver is going to say, why are these rash of armed robberies happening in this community? They're going to look at the structure and the layout of the physical environment. And what they found was, on this street of 3 abandoned houses where there was one senior citizen male living by himself who couldn't keep up his house, there was no lighting there, the officers clearly understood what was going on. They were targeting this specific part of the block. So what did they do? Got the neighbors and themselves to clean up the block, add some lighting. In this particular case, we never arrested the individual, but guess what? The armed robberies of pizza folks in that particular community stopped. And so even though our main goal is to arrest individuals, our bigger goal is around solving problems and doing it and co-producing it with community. So this is just another one. It just talks about a particular community where 90% of the investigative time in this particular jurisdiction was spent in this neighborhood. There were only 3% of the population of the neighborhood. What we did was bring officers, community members, apartment owners, elected officials together, and we co-produced a response. That there were these 25 things that if we did them, we thought we could really impact the crime rate. Most of the things on that list were not law enforcement things. So although we started the discussion because it was a crime issue, we weren't the solution. And we recognize that. We're willing to support the community, but also step back and allow the community to do what they needed to do. So some was lighting, some were about the leases, agreements, some were impacting crime rates, and so doing some stuff around a particular business that was there that was the hub of a lot of crime. But again, just for time's sake, I won't go into all the details, but it does give you a sense of how we think differently about our role. It is about solving crime, but it's also about being a partner in solving problems. Just this image is really about looking at the entire criminal justice structure and looking at the various places of where people may come into contact with the criminal justice system. And law enforcement has a major role to, excuse me, a major role to play in all of these intercept points. And so for us to understand our role and to really think differently about deflection and diversion, how we keep people from engaging with the system, how we play our part as law enforcement, I think is a really important role. And community engagement allows us to hear, listen, and learn and understand that we do have a role to play in law enforcement. And then obviously just our contact information. If folks have follow-up questions or want to talk much more about a specific part of this, definitely willing to have that discussion and always share. And with that, I will turn it back over to the moderators for any questions they may have.
Excellent. Thank you both so much for this information. I do have a couple of follow-up questions. As you know, here with MML, we are a group of local community leaders. So what advice do you have for maybe local elected officials or even professional staff? How can they support this work within their own law enforcement agencies?
I'll say for the elected officials, I know there's pressure that you hear from your constituents. And oftentimes what I've seen is, or what I've seen from some of my colleagues is, they hear from the loudest, and the loudest does not always represent the most people. And it's not that you need to ignore the loudest, but you need to just take in as much information as you can and not be inclined to respond or react right away because the loudest voice is insisting that you do something right away. And this goes back to the whole defunding discussion. I mean, there's a lot of energy around defunding the police and passing this, having this and putting this in place. And what I would say to elected officials is, yes, I hear you. Let me capture all this. Let me get more information. And especially as it relates to your law enforcement partner here, your chief or your director, then sit down with the director and start talking about what strategy do we have to put in place to now move the discussion. And the last thing I'll say to the people, elected officials and appointed officials, when they hear from the community, I always ask them this: tell me what outcome you're looking for. So if we do this, what will it look like? Because as oftentimes we do stuff in response to what the community says, and guess what? We still haven't addressed the problem. And civilian oversight is one of those issues. And really quick, I know there are communities throughout the country that has had civilian oversight for decades, and the police department is not any better, and the relationship with the community is worse. So is it the oversight that's the answer, or is it something more systemic that we need to examine and make sure that we're getting the outcomes that we want? So don't give in to that immediate public pressure and feel you have to act right away.
I can just add two quick pieces to that. I think one, and I say this to everyone, not just electeds, but I'll be honest, I didn't know about the structures of criminal justice. I had a lot of assumptions about it. But then once I started working in it, now I understand how you can change the cogs of the wheel to make the change that you really want to see. The other, and I'll use it, this is a real life example for us, and this is about hearing people, but also having the patience and the thought to make quality decisions. So in our case, I often say we're not afraid of the defunding discussion. In fact, in some ways, we've already begun that a couple of years ago. So in our community, we are the only county in the state of Michigan that has a public safety and mental health millage. The voters approved it 2 years ago. And what the millage was really about was all about diversion, deflection, and this kind of work of having social workers respond to mental health calls or co-training. And so we have a lot of that in existence now. And the reason I bring it up related to defunding and the wanting to make these quick decisions is, for us, what I often say is, this is a false narrative that it's one or the other. We have to defund the police to fund behavioral health. Why not do both? Or why not look at where ways can be done and overlap? So in our community, we've actually built up both. Instead of a race to the bottom, we've actually really funded training and mechanisms to help officers. So we have a 24-hour crisis line for community mental health. Any of our officers can call a social worker to show up 24/7 in our community to meet them at the doorstep, and they'll come out right away. We have an assessment center. An officer, instead of having to take someone to jail or drop them at Psych ER in the hospital, we can take them in. It's currently being developed, but soon they'll be able to drop them off at this 23-hour stay where they'll be assessed by a social worker who can triage and then help them deal with whatever crisis they are in. It is the millage and those funds that have allowed us to create the structures and the systems to do ultimately what our community values. If we simply say, take the money away from law enforcement, well, law enforcement still has to respond to certain things and still has to be trained in certain ways. So again, I would just say it is about understanding the structure, and then how do we make these really important decisions that don't have to be scary, but they can be really thoughtful. And I think we've tried to take that approach in our community.
So you talk about understanding the structure and perhaps not knowing it well enough before you came into your role, Director Jackson. Can you talk more about how that experience has allowed you, or how that's informed you as you've tried to demystify the structure maybe for your community members?
Yeah, I would say that a couple of pieces. No matter where side of the spectrum you're on, I think the recognition and the understanding that we're all in this together, and that we need to be able to listen to check our own biases. There's sometimes that I hear some of my social work friends say things and I'm like, oh, but there's also times where I hear our officers say things and I'm like, oh. And so being able to walk that middle ground, particularly as elected officials who have to make these really tough decisions, and be able to say, like, let's take all the information in, help distill it. And sometimes we have to be the leaders to help demystify things, to get to your question. I think it is about those long-term relationships. There are tough discussions that I have to have on a daily basis, but I don't try to defend things that are indefensible amongst law enforcement in the history. Like, I acknowledge that as well. It's okay. Like, there are certain things that law enforcement has done, and we've been our own worst enemy. But on the other side, when things are done right, or when the community is a little bit off, I feel it's just my job to give out facts and try to help educate people. I don't try to sway people to say, you have to do this particular mechanism or this mechanism. I have a lot of faith in our community to say, like, if I can give them the truth and the facts and have that relationship to where they actually listen to it. Because the other thing is, I can say the same things over and over and over. If people don't trust the police or don't trust us or me, they're not going to listen. That's where these other mechanisms come in. If an outreach worker can go to their community and say, listen, I'm just telling you, this is also how it works, they have a trust and a credibility. Or if an officer can go to their community because they have a certain level of trust and credibility, and we're all saying the same things, then you're having a holistic discussion with your community to where you're hearing it and delivering it in all those different facets. So I think that's one of the ways that it's helped me in this job.
Thank you for that. I also want to get to advice that either of you might have for other law enforcement agencies as they begin to sort of think through this culture and this process. For other agencies who might not have thought of community engagement as more of a holistic strategy, we know that local governments in Michigan and law enforcement agencies continue to be strapped for funding and strapped for many resources. So what's your advice in sort of approaching that from a law enforcement perspective?
I think we have to lean in. Now, I'm using this word more and more. Derrick sort of mentioned it. We talk about this a lot. Oftentimes we have been our worst enemy because we have not taken the time and taken a step back and listened to what's being said, and for fear, I guess, of losing something. And the most important thing that we have is the trust and relationship with the people. My advice is, look, engage, lean into folks, and then just keep reminding folks that we're in this for the long haul, and let's have strategic discussions. So let's have strategic long-term discussions about, first, where do we want to end up? What are the outcomes, what we call ultimate outcomes? And then how do we get there? So we say mission or outcome drives strategy. That drives structure. And that's when you start talking about finance. So here's a key thing, and I'm sure at the MML you'll appreciate this. In the public sector, I think we restrict ourselves way too much because we always start with the money first. So if I start a strategy discussion around money, I've already limited myself. I limited my creativity. I've limited my options. I've limited everything. But if we say, I know money's going to be an issue, but let's talk first about mission or outcomes. What are we really trying to achieve? What would it look like? Especially when you're engaging community members, get them to start describing for you, if we had everything that we wanted, it would look like this. My experience would be that. Then we start talking about, well, okay, what strategies do we have to be in place to achieve that outcome? Then that takes you to the behavior of your staff. That advises you around policy and training. But from a community perspective, it starts to align around programs. And if I start with outcomes, here's the one thing that has not failed yet. Every time we start a discussion that way, we find out that pretty much we want the same things. So think about this. If I have a potential for an adversarial relationship and I start a conversation with people, and we come to the conclusion that we're really striving for some of the same things, then we focus on that and less on the things that we disagree. And I think that's the start. And then we just have to be patient and diligent and vigilant and commit to getting things done.
I'll just say to the law enforcement folks, it's an officer safety issue. I know we talk about that a lot in the criminal justice world and policing world. When your community has an understanding of what policing really is or isn't, when they have actual tangible relationships with specific officers with a badge, and it's not just that unit, but across the community and the organization, I think that becomes an officer safety issue. And I'll give you an example. We have a group where we work with mothers whose children are involved in the criminal justice system. And it's one of the most powerful things we do. And people will say, well, why does the sheriff's office run a support group for moms? Well, what happens is you have moms who feel isolated, don't understand the system. You have officers that are dealing with their kids on a regular basis, the frequent flyers, right? So now you have some of the officers who are dealing with those young people in the same room, excuse me, with some of the moms. In the beginning, you would have a mother on the street potentially cussing out a potential officer. Now those same moms are in a room with an officer that they see on a regular basis. Now they have a relationship. So now the next time that young person is doing something wrong, guess who that mom is calling? Sometimes we have to force them to call 911 because they just want to call that specific officer. Now there's a relationship where that officer can show up even before anything happens, and their mom is actually asking the officer that they once had an adversarial relationship with, how can you help me deal with my child? And so that becomes a safety issue and a community safety issue. The other one is I would say is not doing this. If the issue, and it will potentially happen at some point in your community, when the match is lit, if you don't do this work now, you are going to have a blaze in your community that you cannot stop, and we see it across the national media. And I'll just say this, we are not perfect at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. We do a lot of things. Some of the protests in Michigan started here at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. However, the relationships we had, the trust that we had, and the values that I think our community had allowed for our protests to be done in a way and in partnership where things can change, not to where things started to burn. And I think if there's nothing else for our law enforcement leaders to get, it is that. Do it now, because once the match is lit, if you try it then, it's just way too late. And the costs are just way too much.
Wow. Well, thank you both so much for that information. I believe we're just about out of time. Again, thank you to our presenters, Director Jackson, Sheriff Clayton, for joining us today. As a reminder, after the webinar, we will email today's PowerPoint and any links referenced out to all of our participants. In addition, as has been the case with all of our other webinars, this will be posted in multiple formats for you to review or share on our website at www.mml.org. A few other resources of note: each Monday at noon, we've been conducting our traditional Monday Morning Live as a new working from home series with our lobbying team via webinar. You can join those via Zoom or watch live on our Facebook page. Next up in our webinar series, we have a webinar on August 5th at noon titled Connecting Residents to Michigan's Eviction Diversion Program, and another webinar on August 6th at 2 p.m. titled Identifying the Barriers to Equity, Understanding the Local Impacts of the Criminal Justice System. Stay tuned for more information and other important webinar topics as we continue to provide you with timely updates and resources. Thank you all. Thank you to our speakers. And that concludes our session today.
Thank you.